Something happened in Ottawa this week that barely made headlines, yet it may become one of the most important economic developments of the year. No emergency summit. No dramatic press conference. No breaking news banner flashing across television screens. Instead, two trade ministers sat down, exchanged signatures, and announced that Canada and Turkey would begin formal exploratory discussions toward a possible free trade agreement. On paper, it looked routine. Governments launch trade discussions all the time. But beneath the diplomatic language lies a much bigger story. This is not simply about Canada and Turkey. This is about Canada's accelerating effort to fundamentally redesign its economic future at a moment when its traditional relationship with the United States has become increasingly uncertain. It is about Ottawa recognizing a vulnerability that has existed for decades, and finally deciding it can no longer ignore it. For generations, Canada's economic model was remarkably simple. Build products, ship them south, sell them to America. Repeat. The strategy worked because the United States represented the largest consumer market in the world, sharing a border, language similarities, integrated supply chains, and decades of political cooperation. Over time, this relationship became so successful that Canada gradually concentrated an extraordinary amount of economic risk into a single customer. Today, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports still flow to the United States. For decades, policymakers acknowledged this dependence but rarely acted on it. Why would they? The system was working. Then the political environment changed. The return of tariff-driven trade policy in Washington transformed what had once been viewed as a theoretical risk into a very real economic threat. Suddenly, Canada's largest customer was willing to use market access as leverage. That changed everything. A business that relies on one customer for 75% of its revenue isn't diversified. It's exposed. And Canada is beginning to realize the same principle applies to countries. Prime Minister Mark Carney has responded with one of the most ambitious trade goals in modern Canadian history. The objective is simple to state, but incredibly difficult to achieve. Double Canada's exports outside the United States within a decade. That means increasing non-U.S. exports from approximately $300 billion to roughly $600 billion by 2035. Think about what that really means. This isn't tweaking trade policy. This isn't finding a few new buyers. This is attempting to rebalance an entire national economy. To accomplish it, Canada has launched a global search for new partners across Asia, the Middle East, South America, Europe, and now Turkey. The government understands something important. No single country can replace the United States. But a network of many countries might. At first glance, Turkey might seem like an unusual choice. But strategically, it makes enormous sense. Turkey is not merely another export destination. It occupies one of the most important geographic positions on Earth. Located between Europe and Asia, Turkey sits at the crossroads of multiple regions. Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, the Black Sea region, North Africa. Few countries possess comparable geopolitical significance. With a population of roughly 85 million people, Turkey represents a large and growing market. It also serves as a logistical gateway into regions where Canadian businesses have historically had limited access. For Canada, Turkey offers more than customers. It offers reach. A strong commercial foothold in Turkey could become a launchpad for expansion throughout an entire region. The most fascinating aspect of this relationship isn't trade, it's energy. Earlier this year, Canada and Turkey signed a memorandum of understanding to explore Canadian nuclear reactor technology in Turkey. The focus is Canada's famous CANDU reactor system. This changes the entire equation. Trade agreements are valuable. Nuclear partnerships are transformational. A major reactor project can be worth tens of billions of dollars and create economic relationships that last generations. Unlike ordinary exports, nuclear infrastructure creates decades of dependency. Fuel supply, maintenance contracts, technical expertise, engineering support, regulatory cooperation. These projects bind countries together economically for decades. That's why the Turkey discussions are attracting attention among policymakers, even if the broader public hasn't noticed yet. Because when trade negotiations and nuclear cooperation advance simultaneously, governments are no longer thinking quarter to quarter. They're thinking generation to generation. This relationship isn't one-sided. Turkey also has compelling reasons to move forward. Turkey has spent years attempting to diversify its energy future. Its first major nuclear facility is being developed with Russian involvement, creating political complications amid broader geopolitical tensions. Canadian nuclear technology offers an alternative. For Ankara, deeper ties with Canada provide access to advanced technology, new sources of investment, stronger connections with a G7 economy, enhanced cooperation within NATO, reduced dependence on existing energy suppliers. In other words, both countries are seeking greater strategic flexibility. That creates genuine alignment, and successful trade agreements usually emerge when both sides believe they need each other. The Canada-Turkey story is actually part of a much larger global shift. For decades, international trade operated under a basic assumption: the United States would remain the central pillar of the global economic system. Countries built supply chains around American consumers. Investors assumed stable access to U.S. markets. Governments structured economic strategies accordingly. Today, that assumption is being questioned. Not because America is weak. Quite the opposite. Because America is increasingly willing to use its enormous market power as a strategic tool. When access becomes conditional, countries begin searching for alternatives. That is exactly what Canada is doing. The discussions with Turkey join a broader Canadian push involving Southeast Asia, India Gulf states, South America. Emerging markets worldwide. Ottawa is effectively building a portfolio approach to trade. Instead of relying overwhelmingly on one relationship, it wants dozens of meaningful relationships. None of this will be easy. Trade agreements are notoriously difficult. Turkey's customs arrangements with Europe create additional complexity. Canada's protected agricultural sectors remain politically sensitive. Industrial competition in steel and manufacturing will generate resistance. And perhaps most importantly, exploratory talks are not negotiations. They are simply the first step. Canada and Turkey attempted a similar process more than a decade ago. The effort eventually stalled. History shows there are no guarantees. A signed statement is not a signed deal. The most important question isn't whether Canada and Turkey eventually sign a trade agreement. The real question is whether Canada remains committed to diversification if pressure from Washington decreases. Because diversification is easy to support during a crisis, it becomes much harder when old relationships become comfortable again. If tariffs ease, if tensions cool, if trade flows normalize, will Canada continue investing political capital in new partnerships? Or will it drift back toward the familiar model that dominated the last generation? That question may ultimately determine whether Canada's current strategy becomes a historic transformation, or simply a temporary reaction to uncertainty. The Canada-Turkey announcement may appear modest today, but history often begins quietly. Major geopolitical shifts rarely arrive with dramatic headlines. They begin with small decisions: a meeting, a signature, a new conversation. What Canada is attempting right now is bigger than one trade deal. It is testing whether a middle power can successfully reduce dependence on a dominant neighbor without sacrificing prosperity. Turkey represents one piece of that puzzle, not the entire solution, but an important piece nonetheless. And if Ottawa succeeds in building dozens of relationships like this over the next decade, Canada may emerge with something it has rarely possessed in modern economic history: strategic choice. The ability to say no because it finally has somewhere else to go. And that may be the most significant consequence of all.